Thomas Callahan would later understand something most men learn too late: she didn't fail to arrive. Someone made sure she couldn't. The train came in screaming like a wounded animal. Steam burst into the frozen air, white and violent, swallowing the platform in a cloud so thick Thomas Callahan couldn't see 5 feet ahead of him. For one sharp, stupid moment, his hand dropped to the revolver at his hip, not because he expected trouble, because his body remembered danger before his mind could argue it away. When the steam thinned, the train stood there breathing hard, iron wheels creaking, lanterns swaying. Doors opened, boots hit wood, voices rose. Laughter, complaints about the cold. Thomas didn't move. He stood near the end of the platform, coat pulled tight, hat low, eyes locked on the last passenger car. He had been standing there for hours already. 3 days, if a man measured time by waiting instead of sleep. If Isabel Moreno stepped down from that car, he wanted to be the first thing she saw. She didn't. Families poured past him. A ranch hand with a crate of chickens. A woman holding a crying baby. 2 men arguing about freight that hadn't arrived. The conductor tipped his cap and called out the town name like it still mattered. Santa rose out of the line. The last door slammed shut. The conductor gave a sharp whistle. Steam surged again. The train pulled away, slow at first, then faster, until it was nothing but a fading sound swallowed by the white hills beyond town. The platform emptied. Thomas was still standing there. He took off his gloves and looked at his hands. The skin across his knuckles was split and raw from the cold. He hadn't noticed. He rarely did anymore. Behind him, someone cleared their throat. "She ain't coming, Tom." He didn't turn. He already knew who it was. Old Mr. Finch, the station clerk. Finch had been watching him all morning with the same look a man gives a dying animal, pity mixed with impatience. "She'll come," Thomas said. Finch sighed. "This is the 3rd train." Thomas folded the gloves slowly, carefully, like the act itself mattered. "Trains get delayed. Mail order brides don't," Finch said, not unkindly. "Not without reason." Thomas finally turned. That word settled heavy in the cold air. Reason. "You ever read her letters?" Finch blinked. "No." "Then don't tell me what she would or wouldn't do." Finch raised his hands in surrender. "Didn't mean nothing by it. Just saying folks are starting to talk." Thomas nodded once. He'd heard them already. In the saloon, at the Mercantile. Whispers that followed him like shadows. Poor Tom. Ordered himself a wife and got nothing but silence. He picked up his saddlebag from the bench and slung it over his shoulder. "She'll come," he said again, not to Finch this time, but to the empty platform. To the mountains. To whatever had decided to test him. He walked away before Finch could answer. Thomas lived on the edge of town, where the buildings thinned and the land remembered what it had been before people named it. His house was small, 1 room with a lean-to barn and a split rail fence that leaned worse every winter. Smoke rose from the chimney when he was home. That was how people knew. Inside, the stove was cold. He hadn't bothered lighting it that morning. He set his saddlebag on the table and took out the letters. There were 6 of them, folded soft from use. He didn't need to read them to know what they said. He knew the words by the way they felt in his hands. Still, he opened the last one. "Dear Toms, the road west is longer than I imagined, but I am not afraid. I think of you when the nights are cold. I think of the house you described, and the horse you said listens better than most men. When I arrive, I will wear the blue dress. You will know me." He closed his eyes. Blue dress. He could see it clear as day. Not fancy, just clean, practical. Like the way she wrote. Isabel Moreno did not strike him as a woman who broke promises lightly. He folded the letter and put it back with the others. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the window. Snow slid off the roof in a soft rush. The mountains to the north were hidden behind low, heavy clouds. That was new. The weather had turned faster than expected. Thomas lit the stove and stood watching the fire catch. He told himself the same thing he had told Finch. Trains get delayed, but wagons didn't vanish. By late afternoon, he was back in town. The saloon was warm and loud, thick with the smell of whiskey and wet wool. Thomas stood near the door, listening more than drinking. He had learned long ago that men talked more freely when they thought no one was paying attention. "North Trail," someone said. Thomas turned his head just enough. "Swear to God." The voice continued, a trapper named Hale. "Saw wagon tracks up near the pines yesterday. Fresh enough. 3 families, maybe 4. Headed this way." "And?" another man asked. Hale shrugged.
Didn't see M today.
Thomas set his glass down untouched and walked over.
You sure about those tracks?
He asked. Hale looked up, startled, then nodded.
Sure as I am about anything. Why? When? Yesterday morning. Which trail?
Hesitated.
The northern cut, past the old mining road.
The room seemed to tilt.
That trail's dangerous in winter,
Tom said.
Yeah.
Hale.
That's what I thought.
Thomas pulled on his gloves.
You see any sign of trouble?
Hale shook his head.
No broken wheels, no blood, just nothing.
Nothing was worse. Tom was left without another word. By dawn he was riding north. The town fell away behind him, replaced by open land and the slow rise of trees. His horse, Cielo, moved steady beneath him, breath puffing white in the cold. Tom's kept his eyes on the ground, reading it like a book written in scars and shadows. Wagon tracks, faint but there. They cut through the snow in a wavering line, half filled by drifting powder. Old enough to worry him, new enough to matter. He followed them into the foothills, where the wind sharpened and the trees crowded close. The sky pressed low, heavy with promise of more snow. By midday, the trail narrowed. The tracks veered off the main road. Thomas slowed. He dismounted and crouched, brushing snow aside with his bare hand. The wheel marks were deeper here. One had skidded. Another had cut sharp to the side. Panic left marks. Even when men tried to hide it, he stood and scanned the trees. That was when he saw the smoke. Thin, gray, rising where no camp should be. Thomas mounted and urged Cielo forward. The smell hit him first, burned wood, old cold. The wagon lay on its side in a shallow valley, half buried in snow. Canvas torn, crates smashed open and emptied. No horses. For a moment the world went quiet. Then he saw the hand, pale against the dark wood, fingers curled unmoving. No, he whispered, already running. He dropped to his knees beside the wreckage, digging frantically. Snow filled his sleeves. His hands burned.
Isabel,
he said, the name tearing out of him. Her face emerged from beneath the canvas, skin white as frost, hair stiff with ice, lips blue. He pressed his ear to her chest. Nothing. Then, so faint he almost missed it. A breath.
Hold on,
he said.
I've got you.
A sound behind him made him turn. A child stood a few paces away. Barefoot, wrapped in a torn shawl, holding a doll with one eye missing. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She just watched him with eyes too old for her face. Thomas reached for her. And somewhere in the trees, something shifted. He froze. The valley was no longer empty. He didn't know what waited beyond the trees. Men-wolves. Worse. All he knew was that the woman he had been waiting for lay half, dead in his arms, and a silent child stood between him and whatever had done this. Thomas tightened his grip on Isabel and drew his revolver with his free hand. The wind carried a sound that might have been a voice, or a warning. And as the light began to fade, one thought burned clear in his mind: she didn't leave me. Something stopped her. The snow was falling harder now. Thomas trudged forward through the narrowing trail, his breath sharp in his chest, every step sinking deep into the powder. Cielo pushed on ahead of him, hooves crunching through the crusted snow. Behind them, the wagon wreck and the valley of ghosts faded into the whiteout. Isabel was draped across the saddle, limp and silent, her breath misting faintly in the air. He had wrapped every spare blanket and piece of wool around her. She hadn't stirred since he pulled her from the wreckage. The child, Rosita, he'd learned from a name stitched faintly on the doll's torn apron, rode in front of him, pressed against his chest beneath his coat. Her tiny frame was shaking, but she hadn't spoken a single word. Just wide, blinking eyes and shallow breathing. Still barefoot, her feet were wrapped in pieces of Thomas's undershirt, torn and tied hastily with his belt. It was all he had. The storm was closing in fast. Visibility had dropped to less than 50 yards. If he didn't find shelter soon, they wouldn't make it back to Santa Rosa. He scanned the tree line. There a faint line of smoke, curling weakly against the pale sky. He steered Cielo toward it, heart hammering. He recognized the shape of the hill, the bend in the trees. Don Manuel's cabin. Cielo stumbled once but righted himself. Thomas tightened his grip on Rosita and pressed his boots into the stirrups. By the time they reached the cabin, Thomas's arms were numb. He banged on the door with his boot, then kicked it open. Don Manuel was already on his feet, rifle half raised. He lowered it fast when he saw Thomas. Then his eyes shifted to the woman slumped over the saddle, and his jaw tightened. You brought the storm with you. said quietly. Thomas slid off the horse, lifting Rosita first, then Isabel. Don helped pull them inside, working silently, efficiently. The cabin was small but warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. Dry herbs hung from the ceiling. A stew pot simmered over the coals, its scent cutting through the cold in Thomas's lungs. He laid Isabel near the fire, cushioning her head with his saddle blanket. Don took Rosita from his arms and wrapped her in furs, placing the doll beside her.
Talk,
Don said. Thomas crouched by Isabel, brushing ice from her brow.
Wagon was wrecked. Bandits, maybe. Everything was torn apart. No horses, no food. She was under the canvas, nearly frozen. The girl was just standing there.
Don squinted toward the window. Snow was building fast against the pane.
I knew that trail was cursed,
he muttered. Thomas looked up.
You seen anything?
Don shook his head.
Not in days. But the woods are too quiet.
Thomas peeled off his gloves, flexing stiff fingers.
Think someone's following us.
Don glanced down at Rosita. The girl was awake now, eyes glassy, clutching the doll like it was her last tether to the world.
Something scared her bad,
he said. Thomas nodded.
She hasn't said a word.
They worked quickly. Don prepared a poultice for Isabel's chest. Thomas bit up the fire. He could hear the wind howling now, high and sharp, like a scream swallowed by the trees. Night fell fast. They took turns dozing. Thomas sat by Isabel, watching her breathe. Each rise of her chest was a victory. Rosita stirred once in the night, eyes fluttering, and whispered something in Spanish. Thomas leaned in.
Ma'am,
she said, then fell back into silence. Her voice was faint, rasping. His jaw clenched. By dawn, Isabel was stirring.
Thomas, I'm here.
She blinked slowly, disoriented.
You came.
He took her hand gently.
You never showed up. I had to know why.
Her lips trembled.
The wagon, we were ambushed.
She closed her eyes, forcing the words out. Thomas leaned in.
We joined with 2 other families, headed west. It was safer, we thought. But 2 days from town, they came. Who? 3 men, maybe more, covered faces. They had knives. One had a gun, but old, rusted. They wanted our food, blankets, horses. Did they hurt anyone? They tipped the wagon, took everything. The men tried to fight. One was shot. I hid Rosita under flour sacks. She didn't make a sound.
Tom swallowed hard.
I thought they'd kill us all,
Isabel whispered.
But they just left, like we didn't matter.
Thomas squeezed her hand.
You mattered to me.
Don stirred in the corner.
You say they took the horses.
Don scratched his chin. Isabel?
Then they're still close. Can't go far on foot in this weather.
Thomas stood.
Then we go after them. You're half dead yourself.
Don.
They could hit another wagon, another town.
Don looked from Isabel to Rosita.
You got more than vengeance to think about now, Joe.
Thomas didn't answer. He stepped outside. Snow was thigh-deep. The trail was gone, swallowed in white, but he could feel it. Whoever did this wasn't gone, not yet. He turned back inside.
I'm taking them to Santa Rosa,
he said.
They need warmth, real care. I'll come back.
Don watched him silently, then gave a slow nod.
Leave at first light. If they're smart, they'll be watching the roads.
They left as the sun fought its way through the clouds. The air was bitter, but the worst of the storm had passed. The land shimmered under a new blanket of snow, quiet and clean. A false peace. Cielo moved slowly, bearing the weight of all 3 passengers. Thomas kept his eyes on the trees. Isabel was awake now, bundled tight, her head resting against his chest. Rosita slept curled against her side. The child hadn't spoken again, but she'd stopped trembling. As they neared the town's edge, Thomas felt it, movement, a flicker between trees, a breath of heat in the cold. He drew his revolver, heart pounding, nothing. Then the town came into view, smoke from chimneys, the low whistle of the train far off, life. He didn't let himself relax until the doctor's cabin door was open and Isabel was in someone else's hands. Dr. Ortega took one look and swore.
Get her by the stove, now?
Thomas stood back, letting the warmth of the room settle into his bones. The wind outside roared like it was angry he'd made it back. He looked down at Rosita. She was awake again. One small hand lifted, reaching for his coat. He crouched beside her. You're safe now, he said. She didn't answer. just turned her head slowly and pointed toward the woods behind him. Her lips parted, but no words came. Thomas followed her gaze. The trees stood still, but he knew better. No one leaves a trail like that unless they're running from hell. The storm had passed, but the cold had teeth. Thomas Callahan stood just outside the doctor's cabin, staring into the tree line where Rosita had pointed. The wind had calmed, but something about the silence gnawed at him. It was too still, too clean, as if whatever had left its mark on the mountains hadn't gone far. He stepped back inside, closing the door behind him with a slow, tired push. Dr. Ortega was spooning broth into Isabel's mouth. Her face was pale but less gray now. The warmth and food were working, but she still looked like a woman pulled back from the edge of the grave. Rosita sat curled in the armchair near the fire, her doll cradled in her lap, one eye missing, head stitched in rough thread. She was staring into the flames, unmoving, watching something only she could see. Thomas rubbed his hands together, not for warmth, but to settle the growing tension in his chest.
I'm going back,
he said finally. Dr. Ortega looked up.
To the valley.
Thomas nodded.
To find out who did this. You won't find much in this snow,
the doctor said.
And if they're smart, they're long gone.
Thomas's jaw tightened.
If they were smart, they wouldn't have left survivors.
Isabel tried to sit up weakly.
Don't,
she rasped.
Not alone. I won't be,
Thomas said, already pulling his coat from the hook.
I've got someone in mind.
An hour later, he was back in the woods. The trail to Don Manuel's cabin had narrowed even further with fresh snow, but Thomas knew the bends by heart. He could have ridden it blind. He didn't bring Cielo this time. The snow was too deep in places, and he didn't need the noise. The walk was rough, but it cleared his mind. Don Manuel answered the door before he knocked. The old man looked like he hadn't slept.
I figured you'd be back,
he said.
What'd she tell you? Enough,
Tom said.
They weren't bandits, not in the usual sense. She said one had a scar, leather coat, real calm, like he'd done it before.
Don's face twitched.
Scar across his jaw, walk with a limp. You know him?
Don opened the door wider.
Come in.
The cabin smelled of tobacco and pine sap. Don poured them each a finger of whiskey, then sat across from Tom's at the table, his hands wrapped around the tin cup like it might keep old ghosts away.
His name's Julian,
Don said finally.
Or at least it used to be.
Thomas raised an eyebrow.
That's supposed to mean something to me. It should,
Don muttered.
He was one of mine.
Tommet.
Yours,
Don nodded.
Back when I ran the old mission house on the other side of the mountain, before the war, before the railroad came, we took in orphans, strays, the ones the world didn't want. Julian came to us after a mining fire killed his mother. Real quiet kid. Angry though. Real angry. What happened? He ran off when he was 15, stole a rifle and 2 horses, said he'd had enough of rules, enough of God.
Thomas leaned back in his chair.
You think he's the one behind the attack? I'd bet my rifle on it,
Don said.
And I don't make bets I can't cover.
Thomas took a long drink.
So what now?
He asked.
We sit around and wait for him to hit someone else.
Don's eyes sharpened.
No, we draw him out. How?
Don stood, crossed the room, and lifted a dusty map from the wall. He laid it flat on the table, pointing at a narrow cut between 2 ridges.
They'll hole up somewhere near here. Old hunting ground, caves, hidden passes, and there's a creek that runs down the back of the ridge. If they've got stolen horses, they'll need water. That's where we start.
Thomas studied the map, tracing the path with his finger.
You'll come,
gave a dry smile.
I'm too old to run, but I can still shoot.
Thomas grinned.
That'll do.
They spent the next hour packing, ammunition, dried meat, spare blankets. Don gave Thomas an old repeater rifle, cleaned and oiled.
Use it at Palo Alto,
he said.
Still fires true.
Thomas glanced at him. Thomas slung it over his shoulder. Just before they stepped outside, Don paused by the fire and grabbed a silver medallion from a nail near the mantel. He slipped it into his pocket.
Superstition. Insurance,
Don said.
Never hurts to have something blessed, when you're walking toward the devil.
They left just before nightfall. They made camp in a sheltered nook beneath a cliff, far enough from the creek to avoid detection. Tom's couldn't sleep. He lay awake under the blanket, staring up at the stars. Beside him, Don lit his pipe.
You believe in second chances?
The old man asked suddenly. Tom's considered.
Not for men who leave children to die in the snow.
Don didn't answer right away.
I gave Julian his first,
he said.
I won't give him another,
Don whispered. Then, from deep in the woods, a sound. Footsteps too deliberate for animals, crunching snow. Then a soft whistle, low, measured. Don's eyes met Thomas's. He put out the pipe. Both men rose slowly, rifles in hand. Thomas crept toward the edge of the ridge, peering down toward the creek. Moonlight caught movement. A figure crouched by the water, filling canteens. He couldn't make out the face, but the coat was leather long, worn. The man stood, favoring his left leg.
That's him.
Thomas raised the rifle, but before he could fire, another figure stepped into view, this one smaller. A boy, maybe 12, carrying a bundle of firewood. Thomas lowered the rifle. Don cursed under his breath.
We wait,
he said.
Watch where they go.
Thomas nodded, heart pounding. They'd found them. Now came the harder part.
If she's out there, we'd better find her before they do.
The sun broke over the ridge, slow and pale, more light than heat. Thomas and Don Manuel had tracked the gang's trail for hours now, weaving through fur-lined hollows and snow-choked switchbacks. The prints were messy, some boots, some barefoot, others horses dragging behind like afterthoughts. Whoever they weren't trying to hide, or they didn't care who followed. Either way, it meant trouble. Thomas knelt beside a patch of churned snow and studied the marks. A wheel had broken here, splinters scattered across the ice like bones. Something heavy had been dragged, too heavy for a body, not heavy enough for supplies. A chest, a crate. Don stood behind him, rifle slung over his shoulder, chewing a piece of dried jerky like it owed him money.
They're bleeding,
Thomas said. Don raised an eyebrow.
You see blood? No,
Thomas replied, standing.
But they're messy, uncareful, like they've lost whatever discipline they had left.
Don?
Desperation's louder than fear.
He stopped. His voice was low, tight. Thomas kept moving, his breath misting in the crisp air. By mid-morning, the trail dropped into a narrow valley. The trees bent overhead like watching figures. Snow gave way to black mud in places, churned and dark, and Thomas's gut twisted with each step. Then he saw it. A piece of canvas, ripped in half, buried. The corner of a wooden crate. Then something else, sacks, broken lantern glass, a child's boot.
Don.
He turned his head slowly, scanning the wreck. The older man moved beside him, and they both stared at the wreckage. Another wagon, overturned. Tom's moved fast now, wading through the ruin, checking every shape that might be human. Snow drifted over everything like it was trying to erase the truth. Then, from the far side of the wreckage, a sound. A whimper. Thomas.
You hear that?
Don was already moving, eyes sharp.
Behind the wheel frame.
Thomas stepped around a shattered axle and saw her. A girl, older than Rosita, maybe 7 or 8, curled beneath a splintered board. Her hands were raw, wrapped in a man's oversized gloves. Her lips trembled, but she didn't speak. She looked up at them with cracked lips and eyes full of animal fear. Thomas dropped to his knees.
Easy,
he said, voice soft.
We're not here to hurt you.
She flinched when he reached for her, but didn't run.
Name?
Don asked gently. No answer. Thomas offered a blanket from his pack, wrapping it around her.
You alone?
He asked. Don scanned the woods. She nodded barely.
No way she made it here by herself.
Thomas lifted her gently and turned to Don.
We need to get her back.
Don didn't move. His eyes were fixed on the tree line. Hold. Thomas?
What is it?
Don knelt, brushing his fingers through the snow. Boot prints. Dozens, some recent, some already half covered. Then something else, a piece of leather, torn from a coat, burned.
Ambush,
Don muttered. Thomas's grip tightened on the girl.
We're standing in the middle of it, aren't we?
Gave one grim nod.
And they're not far.
A sharp snap echoed from the woods. A branch breaking. Both men turned at once, rifles drawn. Then silence. The girl let out a small cry and buried her face in Thomas's chest.
We can't stay here,
he said. Dr. Ortega met them on the porch of the clinic, frowning. Don didn't argue. They backtracked fast, heading toward the ridge trail, moving quieter now, faster. Behind them something shifted. Not a deer. Not a squirrel. Thomas didn't look back. Neither did Don. By the time they made it to Santa Rosa, the clouds were thick again. Snow would return by nightfall.
Another one.
Thomas gently helped her sit. Thomas nodded and carried the girl inside. Rosita looked up from her corner when he entered, eyes wide. She didn't speak, but something softened in her face. Recognition, maybe, or relief. The girl they'd rescued clung to Thomas's coat until he knelt beside her. Then she pointed, silent, toward the doll in Rosita's arms. They knew each other.
What's your name?
She looked at Rosita, then back at him. She whispered. Don stepped into the room. The name hit him like a hammer.
You sure?
Thomas nodded slowly.
That's the name Isabel mentioned. The mother.
Dr. Ortega's brow furrowed.
The girl in the wagon. She made it,
Thomas said.
She crawled through hell to find us.
He turned to Don.
You saw the tracks. They're not done.
Don nodded.
No, but we've got a face now.
Thomas looked over at Isabel, who was sleeping again, her chest rising steadily. He stepped outside and leaned against the porch post, the cold wind biting through his coat. The town looked peaceful, normal, like it hadn't just brushed the edge of something violent. Don stepped up beside him, lighting his pipe.
They'll come for the girl,
Don said. Then he said quietly. Thomas didn't answer at first.
Let them try.
Don looked over at him.
You ready to finish this?
Thomas's hand closed around the medallion hanging from his neck. Don's lucky charm passed to him that morning like a warning and a blessing. He let out a breath, and slow.
They tried to bury her, but she crawled back.
He turned and looked back through the window, where Esperanza now slept beside her daughter.
And now we bury them.
Don's eyes narrowed.
You sure?
Thomas's voice was cold, certain.
Don't look now, son. We're not alone.
Don Manuel walked ahead of them, rifle across his back, eyes never leaving the path. The wind came first. It swept down from the mountains like a living thing, cold, howling, and sharp as a blade. By the time Tom stepped out of the clinic with Isabel bundled in his arms and Rosita pressed tight to his side, snow was already falling in thick, heavy flakes. The town of Santa Rosa faded behind them faster than it should have. Windows dimmed, doors shut. The storm didn't knock, it took what it wanted. Tom's knew what that meant. They had a few hours at best before night swallowed the mountain whole.
Keep moving,
he called over his shoulder.
Storm's coming down hard.
Thomas adjusted Isabel's weight in his arms. She was still weak, breathing shallowly but conscious. Her skin burned with fever despite the cold. Rosita clung to his coat, her hand clutching his belt. She hadn't spoken all morning.
You okay?
He asked. She nodded once but didn't look up. They passed the last house on the edge of town, the lights inside flickering as if nervous to be left alone. The wind hit harder now, pulling at their coats. The sky above turned iron gray.
Cielo's waiting near the trailhead,
Don said.
I saddled him with enough for a straight ride to the cabin.
Thomas gave a quick nod.
We'll stop there, let the storm pass.
Don looked back.
You think that's what this is?
Thomas didn't answer. By the time they reached the base of the hill, visibility had dropped to nothing. The snow came sideways, angry and fast, and the sound of the wind drowned everything else. Thomas placed Rosita on the horse first, then lifted Isabel behind her. The girl held Isabel tight, small hands gripping her like a lifeline.
You ride steady,
he told Cielo, patting the horse's neck.
No hurry.
Don mounted his own mule.
You ready? No,
Thomas said.
But let's go anyway.
Don hung blankets over the windows. They pushed into the white. The ride was brutal. Snow clung to eyelashes, froze in eyebrows. Trees loomed and vanished. Every shadow looked like a man with a gun. But Cielo was sure-footed and Don's mule never faltered. Tom's walked beside them, rifle slung, eyes scanning. Rosita didn't cry. Not once. That scared him more than the storm. They reached Don's cabin by late afternoon, though time didn't mean much now. The sky never shifted. It just hung there, gray and endless. Thomas kicked the door open with a frozen boot. Heat spilled out like a miracle. Don had left the stove going just in case. They got Isabel near the fire. She stirred once, then settled back into unconsciousness. Rosita sat curled beside her, her face buried in Isabel's side.
"This ain't a night to see out,"
he said.
"And it sure ain't one you want something seeing in."
Thomas moved to the window and peered out. Snow raced past sideways like it had somewhere urgent to be.
"We're not alone out here,"
he said.
"We haven't been alone since you found that wreck."
Thomas turned to him. They both knew it. Tracks didn't lie. Whoever attacked the wagon train hadn't gone far. They'd taken supplies but not enough. They were desperate, hungry, and desperate men didn't leave survivors behind unless they meant to come back and finish the job. Thomas checked the locks, then slid a second rifle under the cot where Isabel slept. The storm screamed louder. Inside, the fire crackled. Don sat at the table, eyes closed, fingers tapping a slow rhythm on the wood.
"You hear that?"
Don didn't open his eyes.
"No, and that's the problem."
Thomas frowned.
"No birds. No animals. Not even the wind through the trees. It's too quiet now. That kind of quiet means something's listening."
A soft sound broke through the silence. Knocking. 3 sharp raps on the door. Rosetta flinched. Don rose without a word and took position by the wall, rifle ready. Thomas moved to the door slowly, silently. He didn't speak, just pressed his ear against the wood. Nothing. Another knock. This one softer. Then a voice.
"Help."
Don shook his head violently. A woman. Fragile. Thomas hesitated.
"It's a trick." "What if it's real?"
Thomas stepped back from the door. Don didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. He'd heard that voice before, and it hadn't belonged to anyone living.
"What do you want?"
Then a whisper. Silence.
"She's ours."
Thomas raised his rifle. Rosetta whimpered. Don grabbed the iron bar used to brace the door and slammed it into place. Outside, something moved. Footsteps, fast, circling the cabin. Then the unmistakable sound of wood scraping against wood. Someone or something was trying to board up the windows from the outside.
"They want us blind,"
Don muttered. Thomas turned to the girls.
"Get them below."
Don didn't argue. He scooped Rosita up, motioned for Thomas to grab Isabel. They carried them both down the hatch behind the stove, into the root cellar, dark and cramped, but safer than upstairs. Don lit a single lantern.
"We hold here till dawn,"
he said. Thomas nodded. The storm roared above, but beneath it all other sounds. Scratching, clawing, low laughter, almost human, almost not. Rosita buried her face in Isabel's shoulder. Thomas sat with his back to the wall, rifle across his knees.
"What are they?"
he whispered. Then, Don didn't answer at first.
"Ghosts wearing the skin of the desperate."
The lantern flickered. Rosetta finally looked up at Tom's. Her voice, when it came, was small, broken, but it was there.
"They came before."
Thomas leaned in.
"When?"
She pointed up.
"Last night, when you left."
Thomas's blood turned to ice.
"They wanted Ma'am,"
she whispered.
"But she was too strong, so they waited."
Outside, the wind dropped, just for a second, enough to hear it, the voice again, a whisper through the cracks in the floorboards.
"You get her safe. I'll deal with the dark."
The storm didn't ease until dawn. For hours, they sat cramped in the root cellar, Don leaning against the dirt wall, Tom's on a stool with his rifle resting across his lap, and the girls curled together beneath blankets, asleep but restless. Every so often, the cabin above them groaned under the weight of wind and snow. But worse were the sounds they couldn't place, footsteps that stopped when listened for, breathing that wasn't theirs, the occasional rattle of something brushing the windows like fingers too long. When the world above finally grew quiet, Don was the first to move. He snuffed the lantern and pushed open the hatch slowly, careful not to make a sound. Snowlight filtered down from the main room. It was dim, gray, soft, the kind of light that comes after something breaks. Thomas followed him up. The cabin was a wreck. One shutter had been torn off and left swinging. The front door was scratched to the wood, deep gouges like claws or knives, testing the frame. Snow had pushed in through every crack, covering the floor in a thin film of cold silence. But the fire was still smoldering and the rifles were untouched.
"They left,"
Don said, eyes scanning every corner. Thomas didn't relax.
"Or they're waiting."
He walked to the window, brushing the snow from the inside pane with his sleeve. Tracks. A dozen, maybe more, leading into the trees. They circled the cabin in wide loops, some coming as close as the back steps.
I don't like this,
Don muttered. Thomas turned to him.
We need to get them out, back to town. Isabel needs help. She made it through the night. Barely, and I won't gamble she can do it again.
Don gave a sharp.
We'll ride soon as we warm the horses.
They packed fast. Isabel could barely stand on her own, but she was awake. Her skin was pale, her lips dry, but she was there, her eyes tracking them, her voice a whisper, but steady.
Rosita,
she asked. The little girl appeared beside her like a shadow. Isabel reached for her, pulled her close. They held each other in silence for a long moment.
She saved me,
Isabel murmured.
I don't know how, but she did.
Thomas watched them, something twisting inside him. Something he didn't want to name just yet.
We'll get you both home,
he said. Don stepped in with the last of the supplies.
Cielo's ready, but we ride fast. No camp, no stops.
Thomas nodded.
We don't stop for anything.
They mounted quickly, Isabel riding behind Thomas this time, wrapped in blankets, her head resting against his shoulder. Rosita rode with Don tucked between his arms, her small hands clutching the saddle horn. The storm had flattened the world. Trees bent under the weight of snow. The trail was gone, buried, but Don knew the land by instinct. They cut south through a narrow pass, down a slope that opened into a frozen meadow, then east toward town. It was almost peaceful, until Isabel stirred.
They weren't strangers,
she said softly near his ear. Thomas stiffened.
What? The men who attacked us. They knew each other. The way they moved. The way they fought. It wasn't chaos. It was planned. Bandits work in groups. This wasn't like that.
She lifted her head, and for a moment, her eyes were fierce again.
They didn't want just supplies. They wanted the girl.
Thomas glanced at Don. The old man had heard it too. They stopped to water the horses at a creek that hadn't fully frozen. Don stayed with the girls while Thomas walked downstream to scout the next bend. That's when he saw them. 3 men on foot, moving slow, cautious. One carried a shotgun, another had a length of rope. The third, taller, limping, wore a coat that looked too familiar. The man from Isabel's story. The scar was clear even at a distance, slashing across his left cheek, twisted like melted wax. Scarface. Thomas dropped flat into the snow and watched. They hadn't seen him. They were following tracks, not theirs. His. He backed away slowly, using the tree line for cover, and returned to the group.
Trouble,
he said. Don didn't need more than that. They mounted again and turned off the main trail, cutting through the brush, pushing hard. Rosita began to cry softly, not fear, but exhaustion. Isabel was fading again, her arms loose around Tom's waist.
We can't outrun them forever,
Don said. Thomas nodded.
We don't need forever, just a few more miles.
But they didn't get that. Half a mile from the ridge, Cielo reared up. Thomas pulled hard on the reins, trying to calm the horse, but the sound that spooked him echoed again. Gunfire from the west. A single shot. Then another. Too close, they dropped low, took cover behind a cluster of fallen trees. Rosita curled into Don's coat. Isabel was struggling to stay conscious. Thomas raised his rifle, scanning the tree line. Movement, but no shot came.
They're hurting us,
Don whispered.
Pushing us somewhere.
Thomas frowned.
Why not just shoot us now? Because they want her alive.
Rosita looked up at him. Tears streaked her cheeks. She didn't speak, but her eyes told him everything. She knew them. Not just the man with the scar. All of them. She had seen them before, lived with them maybe, or been taken by them. Thomas looked at Don.
We need to fight.
Don raised a brow.
Now. No.
Thomas said, checking the last of his ammo.
Tonight.
He turned to Isabel, brushing the hair from her face.
Can you hold on a little longer?
She nodded faintly. He squeezed her hand.
We end this.
As they broke out of the trees and saw the outskirts of Santa Rosa glinting through the cold haze, hope stirred. But so did dread, because if they made it back, the fight wasn't over. It was only beginning.
It wasn't an accident, Tom's. They came for us.
Santa Rosa wasn't used to shadows moving at midday, but they came anyway, long and heavy, dragged behind every stranger who stepped off the trails and into town. Thomas noticed it first, the shift in air, like the whole town was holding its breath. Word had spread faster than he liked. Someone had followed them back. Not in the open, Not guns blazing, but eyes. Tracks in the mud outside the blacksmith's barn. A man seen leaving the general store with gloves that didn't match. A boy who said he saw a tall man limping outside the livery, staring too long at the clinic.
They're watching,
Tom said. Don Manuel leaned against the porch post beside him, arms crossed.
They're not ready to strike. Yet.
Inside the clinic, Isabel was asleep again, exhausted from the ride and the fever that hadn't fully left her. Dr. Ortega had done what he could. Her color was better, her hands warmer, but her strength still flickered like a candle in a draft. Rosita sat by the stove, drawing. She hadn't spoken since they got back. Thomas had tried, asked questions, offered food, brought her a new doll from the mercantile, a clean one, with bright yarn hair and both eyes stitched in place. She looked at it once, then set it gently beside the old one. Now she was bent over a piece of parchment, the stub of a charcoal pencil in her small hand. Thomas stepped inside.
What are you working on, Mija?
She didn't answer. He crouched beside her. The drawing was rough but clear. A wagon, flames, stick figures with circles for faces, and in the corner, small, almost hidden, a man with a scar across his cheek. The scar was scribbled over and over, blacker than anything else on the page. Thomas's gut clenched.
Rosita,
he said softly.
You remember what happened, don't you?
Dawn appeared in the doorway. She looked at him, slowly, then nodded.
Boone's ready.
Thomas did.
Sheriff finally believe us. He believes something's coming.
Dawn said.
And he don't want it knocking on his jail door first.
They left Rosita with Dr. Ortega and headed toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Boone wasn't a large man, but he carried himself like he was made of iron. His office was plain maps, wanted posters, a single shotgun behind the desk. He looked up when they entered, had already in his hand.
Tell me what I'm dealing with,
he said. Thomas didn't waste time.
Group of men, at least 5. One with a limp and a scar across his cheek. They hit the wagon train Isabel traveled with, took supplies, left survivors to die.
Boone raised an eyebrow.
Left, not finished the job. Because they were looking for someone,
Thomas said.
The girl Rosita. Why? That's the part we don't know,
added.
But they followed us here, quiet, careful.
Boone rubbed his jaw.
What's your plan?
Thomas met his eyes.
We set a trap.
They spent the rest of the afternoon preparing. Boone pulled together a small group, 2 deputies, and a tracker named Louise, who knew the land better than anyone in 5 counties. They posted men at the key buildings, the clinic, the schoolhouse, the livery. But the bait was Rosita. Thomas hated the thought. Even more when she seemed to understand, without being told. That night, she came to him with her drawing and pointed at the scar again.
Was he ever kind to you?
To? She shook her head.
Did he take you from your family?
Then, slowly, she whispered.
No.
Tell down.
Then who did?
Dawn stepped closer. She pointed at the circle next to the scared man, another figure, a woman.
What is it? She wasn't just taken,
Thomas said.
She was born into it.
Rosita spoke again, barely a whisper.
She called me her little dove.
Dawn stiffened.
That name,
he muttered.
I've heard that before. Years ago. In El Rito, there was a woman, called herself Mother Elsie, said she was starting a new kind of family, took in strays, kids, said she was building something holy.
Thomas's skin went cold.
You think it's the same group? I think it never stopped.
Thomas checked his rifle again. That night, they put the plan into motion. Rosita would stay at the clinic, watched over by Dr. Ortega and Boone's younger deputy, while Thomas and Don patrolled the perimeter. Boone would remain in the jailhouse with Luis, waiting for the signal if anything broke.
If they come, we don't hesitate.
Don gave him a look.
They won't.
Frowned.
Why? Because tonight, we're not the ones being hunted.
Then, glass shattered, the clinic. Thomas ran. He reached the door just as Ortega pulled it open, eyes wild.
They got in through the back.
Thomas pushed past him. Rosita was gone. The back window was open. A single drop of blood on the sill. Don caught up, rifle raised.
She's not far,
Thomas said.
They wouldn't risk a full escape in town.
Don scanned the shadows.
They're making a point.
Thomas's jaw clenched. A message. No more hiding, no more whispers.
There's someone still out there. And she's trying to lead us to them.
The forest swallowed sound like a grave. Thomas ran harder than he had in years, boots crashing through snow and brush, eyes fixed on the broken trail ahead, small footprints, dragging slightly, veering between trees. Rosita had run, or tried to. There were signs of a struggle, then larger prints. 2 men, moving fast, leading her somewhere. Behind him, Don kept pace, breathing heavy but steady, rifle in hand.
She wouldn't go quiet,
Thomas said.
Not unless they made her. She didn't scream either,
Don muttered.
Which means she knew what to expect.
Thomas didn't want to think about that. He didn't want to imagine Rosita slipping back into the silence she had lived in before. He'd seen life return to her eyes, just a flicker, just enough to believe in again. He couldn't lose her now, not to them. The tracks led west, away from town, toward a stretch of canyons that twisted like ribs through the land. It was no accident. Thomas had hunted men before, he knew the signs. This was a funnel, a deliberate path meant to guide the chase where they wanted it.
Trap,
he said, slowing his stride, daunted.
Keep your head down.
They followed the prints along the frozen creek bed, boots crunching ice, breath rising like smoke. Snow still clung to the higher trees, but here it had melted slightly, mud slick underfoot. Then they found the fire pit, old but not too old, ash still warm, stones blackened, meat charred to the bone, and beside it a blanket, worn, child-sized, covered in small uneven stitches. Thomas dropped to one knee, his heart sank.
Rosita,
he whispered. Don stepped carefully around the clearing.
No blood, no drag marks. They're not hurting her, not yet.
Thomas picked up the blanket, pressing it against his chest like the warmth might still be there.
She's scared. Good,
Don said.
Fear keeps her alive.
Thomas stood.
We keep moving.
Thomas exhaled low. They climbed out of the canyon as the sun started to fall behind the ridgeline. The sky turned gold, then pink, then purple, too beautiful for what the night was bringing. Ahead, smoke again, thin and rising from a crack in the rocks. Thomas raised his hand. They crept closer, ducking behind brush, until they reached the edge of a hollow carved into the mountain. A crude camp sprawled inside, a canvas tent, a dying fire, a tethered horse. And near the fire, 3 men. One of them limped. The scar across his cheek caught the firelight like a blade.
Scarface.
Don didn't move.
That's Julian.
They watched in silence, no sign of Rosita.
She's not here,
Thomas muttered.
She was,
Don said, pointing.
That's her doll.
Half buried in the dirt near the fire, the one-eyed doll stared up like it had seen too much. Thomas's hands curled into fists.
I go in quiet, you cover from here.
Don started to object, but then nodded.
Be fast. They move like ghosts when they want to.
Thomas slipped around the edge of the camp, hugging the rock wall, boots silent in the soft earth. He moved behind the horses, past the crates to the far tent. Inside, nothing but rags and bones, not Rosita, but a journal lay open on a crate. He flipped through the pages, squinting in the fading light, names, measurements, children. Some crossed out, some marked with strange symbols. Thomas's stomach turned. A page at the back listed names he recognized: Isabel, Rosita, Esperanza. Beside them the word return. He backed out of the tent. Then came the voice.
You looking for something, friend?
Thomas didn't blink. Thomas turned. Scarface stood 5 feet away, shotgun pointed low, casual but ready.
I came for the girl.
Scarface smiled.
She's gone, taken where she belongs.
Thomas stepped forward, slow.
You're not taking her anywhere ever again. She was never yours to keep,
Scarface said.
She was born to us.
A rustle behind him, Don stepping into the clearing, rifle raised. Scarface raised his hands slowly.
2 of you,
he said.
You think that's enough?
Thomas's voice was cold.
I think we don't need more.
Not theirs. One of the men near the fire dropped. Don fired a second shot, missed but scattered the others into cover. Scarface dove behind a crate. Thomas ran forward, scooping up Rosita's doll, then turned and dove into the trees. Don covered him, laying down rounds as they retreated. Back up the slope, back into the dark. When they stopped again, panting behind a ridge, Thomas clutched the doll like a lifeline. She's close, he said. Don stared ahead into the blackening trees, and then from below a new sound, a cough, a sob, a woman's voice ragged and breaking.
Help!
Thomas.
That's Esperanza,
He whispered. They scrambled down the slope toward the sound. Beneath a ledge, tangled in roots, they found her, mud-caked, frost-bitten, and crawling through the dirt with bleeding fingers.
Rosita,
She gasped.
they took her. I tried.
Thomas dropped to his knees, gathering her up gently.
You found us.
He said. She grabbed his coat, eyes wild.
They're taking her to the canyon before sunrise. Ritual, that's what they said. The little dove will be returned.
Dawn looked at Tom's. No more waiting, no more chasing. They had their answer.
Scarface is real, and I think he used to be one of Dawn's.
Dawn handed Tom's one of the cups. Snow drifted through the pines like ash. Thomas sat beside the fire at Dawn's cabin, Rosita's doll resting in his lap, dirt-stained and missing one arm. Across from him, Don Manuel poured whiskey into 2 tin cups with slow, steady hands. The fire between them cracked and popped, but it couldn't touch the chill sinking into Tom's bones. Esperanza was inside, asleep at last. Dr. Ortega had done what he could, wrapped her fingers, cleaned the cuts on her feet, given her water and broth, but she was spent, body and soul. She hadn't said another word since she passed out. They knew enough, though. Rosita had been taken. Again.
Drink.
Thomas didn't.
You knew him.
Dawn's jaw clenched.
I need to hear it,
Thomas said.
All of it.
Dawn stared into the fire.
He was just a boy.
Thomas wait.
Name was Julian,
said finally.
Came to us when he was 9. His father died in a mine collapse near El Rito. His mother died soon after. Drank herself to death. We took him in at the old mission, same as we did with dozens of orphans. I taught him to shoot, to trap, to read the Bible. He was quiet. Obedient, too obedient.
Thomas tilted his head.
What do you mean?
Don swirled the whiskey in his cup.
Julian didn't ask questions. Ever. You could see it in his eyes. He was always watching, memorizing, waiting. When he was 15, he left without a word. Took a rifle, 2 horses, and half a sack of flour. I never saw him again. Until now.
Don nodded.
Scarface. I knew it was him the second I saw the limp. He busted that leg falling off the mission roof, showing off. I mended it myself.
Tom's leaned forward.
And the woman, Mother Elsie?
Dawn's eyes darkened.
Her name was Elsie Dort. She was a teacher, once. Ran a Sunday school in Taos. But something broke in her. She started preaching about purity through pain. About separating the chosen from the weak. They kicked her out of the church. She came to the mountains. Started collecting strays. Children. And broken men like Julian.
Dawn said.
She told them the world was dirty. That they were clean only if they followed her. She called them the returned. Claimed they were reborn through fire.
Thomas looked down at the doll.
That's what she called Rosita. Her little dove.
Thomas stood. Dawn didn't speak.
They're planning something. Esperanza heard them say it, some kind of ritual. Before sunrise. She's right.
Dawn said.
Tonight's the winter moon. Coldest night of the year. They used it to talk about it at the mission. A time to offer the firstborn. Elsie twisted old stories into prophecy.
Tom stopped pacing.
Then we don't have much time.
Dawn drank the whiskey.
We'll need help.
Thomas shook his head.
No time to ride to town and back. I wasn't talking about the sheriff.
Dawn rose slowly, moved to a shelf behind the stove, and pulled down a dusty tin box. Inside he folded papers, an old rosary, and a tarnished badge.
Used to be a ranger.
Dawn said.
Retired early. Didn't like who I was becoming. But I know 2 men still out this way. One's a tracker. The other, well, he owes me.
Thomas didn't hesitate.
Then let's go.
Dawn gave a dry smile.
You trust me that much?
Thomas met his eyes.
No, but I trust you want to stop this.
That wiped the smile off Dawn's face.
Damn right.
They rode hard through the trees, following a side trail barely wide enough for 1 horse at a time. The sun had dipped below the ridge. Twilight stretched long and blue over the land, the kind of light that made shadows stretch twice their size. They met the first man near an abandoned outpost. He was tall, built like a cedar trunk, with a beard that reached his chest and a dog that moved silently at his heel.
Name's Jason,
Dawn said.
Best tracker I ever knew.
Jace didn't say a word, just nodded, sniffed once, and pointed toward the north slope.
Fresh trail,
he grunted.
3 men, 1 woman, 1 child.
Tom's blood turned to ice.
Rosita. Ritual site's not far.
Jade.
Deep one. Called the Hollow Mouth.
Thomas turned to Dawn.
And the other?
Dawn nodded toward a figure approaching from the trees, a short man with a long rifle and a flask in his hand.
Raise,
he called. The man grinned.
You finally calling in your favor, old man.
Dawn spat.
Wish I wasn't.
Tom's fists clenched. They gathered fast. Jace laid out the terrain, tight canyon mouth, then a series of ledges. The cave went deep. Firelight could be seen inside. At least 4 figures movement. Chanting.
We wait for dark. No.
Dawn said.
We go in now. Before they finish whatever they started.
Thomas swung down from his saddle.
Then we finish it first.
The entrance to the cave was jagged, black as sin. Smoke drifted out heavy with the smell of sage and burning oil. Inside, torchlight flickered against the walls. Shadows danced. Thomas moved in first, crouched low, rifle ready. Dawn came behind, then Jason Ray's voices echoed. A woman's smooth and sing song like a lullaby turned sour.
Little dove, return, return. The world outside does not love you.
Thomas froze. Ahead at the edge of the firelight stood Rosita, her arms bound loosely in cloth, face streaked with soot. She wasn't crying, she was staring, right at him. Then he saw her lips move.
Pop!
Scarface turned, smirking. Something shattered in Thomas's chest. Scarface appeared beside her, hand on her shoulder. But she didn't flinch. Thomas stepped forward.
You found us.
Dawn's voice cut through the air.
And now we end you.
Mother Elsie stepped from the shadows, arms outstretched.
She belongs to us,
she said, voice like poison wrapped in honey.
We are her beginning, and we will be her end.
Thomas didn't wait. He raised the rifle and fired. Chaos erupted. Jason Ray's flanked left and right, gunfire echoing through the cave. Dawn took out the torchman. Scarface shoved Rosetta back toward the altar and fired wildly. Thomas charged through the smoke. Bullets screamed past. Rosita hit the ground and rolled. Tom's dove beside her, wrapped his body around hers.
I got you, Mija, I got you.
Scarface rushed them with a blade drawn. Dawn tackled him mid-swing, and the 2 men crashed against the stone wall in a flurry of fists and curses. Elsie screamed something in a language no one understood. Then Jace shot her. Clean through the chest, she staggered once, reached for Rosita, then collapsed. Scarface scrambled to his feet, blood pouring from his nose. He turned to flee. Dawn didn't let him. The knife slid once. Twice, then Scarface dropped. Silence fell. Only the crackle of the torches remained. Thomas held Rosita close, her small hands gripping his coat. Dawn knelt beside him, breathless.
You all right?
Thomas looked at him.
We're not just all right.
He stood slowly, Rosetta in his arms.
We're taking her home.
Dawn wiped his blade clean.
Good.
And as they stepped out into the frozen night, the last of the chanting died away behind them.
He's close. I can feel him watching.
The sun hadn't fully risen when the riders came into view, 4 of them, ghost-like through the fog curling off the snowfields. Sheriff Boone stood just outside his office, coat drawn tight, one hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Thomas, riding in front, held Rosita close against him. She was wrapped in his coat, head tucked into his chest. She hadn't said a word since the cave. But she hadn't let go of him either. Behind them, Don Manuel and Reyes rode in silence. Jace had peeled off earlier to circle back into the mountains. He didn't like towns, and he liked people even less. He'd done his part. Boone stepped forward, eyes scanning each face. He didn't ask anything, not at first. Just tipped his hat and opened the clinic door himself.
She needs to rest.
Tom's.
She'll get it,
Boone replied.
And then I want the whole damn story.
Dr. Ortega moved fast, setting Rosita down gently on the cot and checking her pulse, her pupils, the scratches on her face. Isabel stirred in the bed across the room, turning her head slowly when she saw them.
Rosita,
she whispered. He turned to Boone. The girl didn't speak, but she reached out, and Isabel's fingers closed over hers like they'd never been apart. Tom's watched them, something easing in his chest for the first time in days. But it didn't last.
They're not all dead.
Boone frowned.
What? Scarface, Julian, he's gone. We thought he was finished, but he disappeared in the cave collapse. Don says there's another exit we missed.
Boone's eyes narrowed.
And you're sure?
Thomas nodded once.
I can feel it. He's not done.
Don leaned against the wall, arms crossed.
That kind of man doesn't die easy.
Boone exhaled slowly, like he was letting out something sore.
Then we need to finish what you started.
Toms shook his head.
Not yet.
Why the hell not?
Toms looked at Rosita.
Because they're not after us anymore. They're hunting something else.
Boone joined him. Later that day, Thomas stood behind the church, arms folded, watching Boone's deputies pile crates of supplies onto a wagon. Rifles, ammunition, lantern oil, rope.
You think they'll strike again?
Then, Thomas didn't answer right away.
They already have. We just haven't found the bodies yet.
Boone grunted.
You've changed. Almost dying with a child in your arms will do that to a man.
Boone offered him a tin cup of coffee. Thomas took it but didn't drink.
They'll regroup,
he said.
Scarface won't let this go. We killed the woman he followed. Took the girl he claimed. That's not something a man like that forgives. So what's your plan?
Thomas looked back at the town, at the clinic, at the bakery, the schoolhouse, the saloon already sweeping its porch like nothing had happened.
We set a trap,
he said. Boone raised a brow.
Here? Where else?
Boone sipped his own coffee.
You offering to be bait again?
Thomas's jaw tightened.
They want Rosita, that hasn't changed. But they also want control. Fear. They think we're broken.
Boone snorted.
Then they don't know Santa Rosa.
Thomas finally drank the coffee. It was terrible, but it warmed him. That night, the town gathered in the saloon, quiet and tense. Boone stood at the center, Thomas and Don beside him.
We've fought hard before,
Boone said.
Raids, fever. But this is different.
Thomas stepped forward. Whispers rippled across the room.
They think we won't fight back. That we're too small, too tired. But they forgot something. This land doesn't bend easy.
Don stepped up, a murmur of agreement.
We're not asking you to go charging into the woods. We just need watchmen, pairs, every building, every night, until this is done.
One by one, men and women nodded. Old ranchers, schoolteachers, young co-hands with hands too soft for killing, but eyes ready for war. Thomas looked at them and felt something stir. Not fear, conviction. The next few days passed in a cold blur of preparation. Boone's men trained the townsfolk how to reload, how to fire, how to signal with lanterns. Thomas spent most of his time with Rosita, who began to talk again, but only in whispers and only to him or Isabel. She described tunnels, chants, and a room filled with names carved into stone.
They said my name would be next,
she said once quietly while Isabel braided her hair. Thomas didn't tell her that they'd found those stones. Didn't say that he'd carved a name of his own into them before they blew the place to hell. His, just in case he didn't make it back. 3 nights later the trap was sprung. It began with a scream near the mill. Then gunfire. Then nothing. Thomas and Don were already in the street when Boone rode up, rifle drawn.
Tracker says they moved fast. 3 men came in through the gulch, hit the supply shed, and vanished. Left one of ours bleeding on the ground.
Thomas cursed under his breath.
It's Julian.
Nodded.
He's testing us.
Thomas's eyes darkened.
Then let's stop playing.
The next night, Rosita didn't sleep. She stood by the window in the clinic, watching the tree line. Thomas sat in the chair beside her, cleaning his rifle.
They'll come,
she said.
I know. I'm not scared anymore.
He looked up at her.
You don't have to be brave for me.
She turned.
I'm not being brave for you.
Then she whispered. A pause.
I'm being brave for them.
She pointed at the town. The people who had taken her in. Protected her. The home she hadn't dared believe she'd have again. Thomas rose and walked to the window beside her. Outside, lanterns glowed on every porch. Rifles rested across rocking chairs. The bakery door was propped open to pass out food to the night watch. Children were asleep with dogs curled by their beds. Santa Rosa wasn't a battlefield, it was a promise. A line in the snow. Thomas looked down at Rosita.
If we don't end this now, he'll never stop hunting us.
By the time Toms and Don reached the ridge overlooking the old mining camp, The sky above it was already painted in orange and smoke. The camp, long abandoned, sat hollow in the center of a burned-out basin surrounded by pine and rock. Whatever Julian and the last of his, the spread fast,
returned,
were planning, they had chosen this place for a reason. Thomas crouched low beside a boulder, peering through the rising smoke.
"Looks like they're burning their own camp,"
he muttered. Don, rifle tight in his grip, squinted.
"Covering their tracks, or calling the last of their flock."
Below, shadows moved between crumbling cabins and stacked crates. 4 men, maybe 5. Some carried torches. One was dragging something heavy wrapped in canvas, too small to be a body, too big to be firewood, supplies, evidence. A moment later, Thomas spotted the unmistakable limp, scarfist Julian, still alive, still walking like the land owed him something. Thomas's jaw tightened.
"He's here,"
Don.
"And he's waiting."
Thomas scanned the upper trail. For what? Neither of them could say. But the camp had that look, too much movement, too many watchful eyes. A trap, no doubt. They hadn't come alone. A quarter-mile behind them, Sheriff Boone and Rise waited with 2 of Boone's best shooters, perched with rifles aimed downhill. They were under strict orders: don't shoot unless you see fire. Which, judging by the smoke, could be any second now.
"There's a bluff above the main shaft. We can use it to drop behind them."
Don checked the wind.
"Smoke's with us. Let's move."
They crept around the outer edge of the basin, boots silent in the ash, until they reached a narrow cut in the rock. From here, the ridge sloped downward, giving them a clear view of the center structure, a rusted smelter building with a stone foundation and a collapsed roof. The firelight flickered inside like the belly of a dying beast. That's when they heard the chanting. Low, rhythmic, male voices layered beneath a single, rising female voice, sharp and haunting, more howl than song. Thomas froze.
"That's not Elsie,"
he whispered.
"She's dead."
Dawn's voice was grim.
"Maybe she taught someone else."
Movement below caught their eyes. Julian stepped out from the smelter building, arms raised. He looked toward the ridge and smiled.
Down.
Dark, bullets sliced the air. Rock exploded inches from Tom's head. They rolled behind cover, returning fire. One of Boone's men lit off a shot from below that dropped a figure carrying a torch. Screams erupted, chaos breaking wide. Thomas rose just enough to spot Julien retreating back into the smelter. He didn't hesitate.
"I'm going in."
Don grabbed his arm.
"That's suicide." "I'm not leaving this unfinished."
Don cursed, checked his rifle.
"Then I'm going too."
They bolted from cover, sliding down the hill as gunfire echoed. The burning camp lit the way like hell's own lantern. They ducked behind crates, leapt over collapsed beams, kicked through smoke and ash. Thomas slammed his boot into the smelter door. It gave way with a crunch. Inside, heat clung to the air. The walls glowed with flickers of flame. Broken equipment lay everywhere. A rusted crucible still radiated warmth from an earlier blaze. At the far end of the room, Julien waited. He didn't have a gun this time. Just a long, curved knife.
"It's not too late,"
he said, voice calm.
"You can still join us."
Thomas stepped forward.
"She's not yours."
Julien shrugged.
"She was never yours either. She was born into fire. All of us were. We just remembered it first."
Don moved to flank him, rifle ready.
"You're finished, Julien,"
he said.
"There's nowhere left to run."
Julien tilted his head, amused.
"You think this is about me?"
Julien spread his arms. He stepped closer to the fire pit in the center of the smelter floor. Inside, something glimmered. Metal. A small cross, children's shoes, burned letters. Tom's throat tightened.
"This is rebirth, and fire cleanses everything."
He lunged. Thomas fired once, but Julien ducked low. The bullet ricocheted off stone. Don moved fast, intercepting, rifle swinging like a club. The two crashed against the wall. The knife flashed. Don grunted, stabbed in the side.
"Don!"
Thomas shouted. Don twisted, snarling, and headbutted Julien backward. Blood streamed down his face, but he didn't fall. Tom's tackled Julien mid-step, and they hit the floor hard. The knife skidded across the stone. They wrestled, fists flying, boots scraping. Thomas took a punch to the gut, then landed one to the jaw. Julien spat blood and laughed.
"You can kill me,"
he hissed,
"but you'll never stop it."
Thomas grabbed the back of his head and slammed it against the floor once, twice, 3 times. The laughter stopped. Julien went limp. Thomas stood, panting hard. Bruised and shaking, he looked at Dawn, bloodied but alive.
You good?
Dawn coughed, nodded weakly.
Ask me later.
Dawn caught his arm. Outside, gunfire had faded. Boone's men had taken the rest or driven them off. The fire still burned, but it was dying now, nothing left to feed on. Thomas turned back to Julienne. Gone. Blood trailed across the floor to a side door. He'd crawled out. Thomas started after him.
No. He's not dead. He will be.
Dawn said.
Out there, alone, bleeding. Let the land take him.
Thomas hesitated, then stepped back. He walked to the fire pit, looked down at the burned remains of whatever had been there. He dropped Rosita's old doll into the coals. Not as a sacrifice, as a signal. This part was over. Outside, the first snow of morning began to fall, soft, slow, pure.
He's not dead. I know it in my bones.
Thomas lay still, blinking against the soft flicker of the clinic lantern. His ribs ached with every breath, his face bruised, hands wrapped in clean bandages. The worst was behind him, but it still felt like his body was holding on to every second of the fight that almost killed him. Outside, Santa Rosa moved quietly. Snow fell light and steady, blanketing rooftops and softening the scars left behind. The air smelled of pine, cold metal, and distant smoke. Reminders that the fire at the mining camp had finally gone out. Inside, it was warm, too warm almost. He shifted, grunted, and winced as pain rippled through his chest.
You're alive.
He managed to smile. He turned. Isabel sat beside the bed, one hand resting on the quilt, the other clutching a cup of tea that had long gone cold. Her eyes were tired, shadowed, but they glowed when she looked at him.
Barely.
She leaned forward.
Don't do that again. What? Get stabbed and thrown into a burning building?
Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes.
Disappear without a word.
He looked down at his hands.
I had to end it. I know,
she said quietly.
But you weren't alone anymore. You never had to be.
Then, he let that sit for a while.
She okay?
Isabeau did.
Rosita's sleeping. She hasn't said much. But she hasn't had another nightmare since they brought you back. Good.
Thomas shifted again, groaning.
Where's Don? 3 buildings over. Stubborn fool's already walking. Sheriff's threatening to tie him to a chair.
Thomas chuckled, then winced. Isabel stood, walked to the window, parted the curtain slightly.
There's talk,
she said.
About what? That he's still out there.
Thomas didn't answer. Julian's blood had left a trail out the side of the smelter. The trail faded after half a mile. Tracks vanished. No body ever turned up. No one ever claimed to see him again. But Thomas had seen the look in his eyes, that flicker of belief stronger than pain or logic. Men like that didn't die easy.
They'll keep watching the woods.
Isabeau,
looking over their shoulders. They should,
Thomas said. She turned to him.
You think he'll come back?
Tom shook his head slowly.
Not like before. The cult's shattered. The fire's gone. But men like him, they survive in the cracks. He'll wait, lick his wounds. And someday, maybe not even for revenge, just to finish what he started, he'll crawl out again.
Isabel looked down.
But when that happens,
Todded,
he won't find the same people.
She glanced at him.
He won't find a girl who's afraid of the dark,
Thomas said.
Or a man who rides alone.
Isabel smiled. A knock sounded gently on the door. It creaked open. Rosita stood there, hair still damp from her bath, wrapped in a blanket nearly as big as her. She held something in her arms, a book.
Hi,
she said. Thomas froze. The word hit him like a stone in the chest, soft but heavy. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Rosita walked forward, climbed carefully onto the edge of the bed, and handed him the book.
It's about a bear who finds his home again, she said. Can I read it to you?
He blinked back, something hot in his eyes.
Please.
She opened the book. Her small voice filled the room, gentle and sure. Isabel stayed by the window, her back to them, but her shoulders trembled as she listened. Thomas didn't remember falling asleep. But when he woke, Rosita was curled beside him, fast asleep, her hand wrapped tightly in his. He recovered slowly. Wounds took time. But healing, real healing, was happening in more than just bones. Santa Rosa returned to something resembling peace. Boone doubled patrols for the first week, then slowly returned to his usual lazy but efficient rhythm. Don sat on the porch of the Mercantile every morning, puffing his pipe and scaring off rumors with a glance. Thomas spent his days helping Isabel with the repairs on the old schoolhouse, and his nights reading Rosita to sleep. One morning, as they were stacking wood beside the new fence post, Isabel turned to him.
"You never answered my question."
He looked up.
"Which one?" "The night you came back. When I asked what kind of man you wanted to be if you stayed."
Thomas wiped his hands on a rag.
"I've been thinking about that."
He leaned on the fence. She waited.
"I used to think I was just a man who kept moving forward. One foot, one road, then another. But now—"
He glanced toward the house, where Rosita's laugh echoed from the porch swing.
"I want to be a man who turns back,"
he said.
"When someone calls, when someone needs."
Isabel stepped closer.
"And now,"
Thomas,
"now I just want to build something that lasts longer than a fire."
She reached up, touched his face.
"You already have."
Later that evening, the town gathered in the chapel. It wasn't a service, no sermon, just quiet music, candles, a few words from Boone about standing together, not just against something but for something. Rosita lit the last candle. When asked what she wanted to say, she stood tall and said one word: "Safe." Everyone clapped. Tom's throat tightened again. He looked over at Isabel, who took his hand without a word. Outside, the wind had quieted. The sky stretched wide and endless above them, filled with stars. Something felt different, not finished, but beginning.
"The past isn't done with us yet, Toms."
The first sign came with the horses, 3 of them. Dead on the edge of town, left in the frost near the old cedar tree where children used to tie prayer ribbons in spring. Throats slit, eyes missing. No blood trail, just 3 frozen bodies in the snow. Boone found them at dawn. He didn't say a word, just covered the carcasses, rode straight to Thomas's door and knocked once. Thomas opened it, coat half on, rifle already slung.
"Trouble,"
Boone nodded.
"Same kind we thought we buried."
Thomas stared at it. Dawn arrived an hour later, face drawn, hands trembling slightly though he tried to hide it. He carried a folded piece of cloth, burnt at the edges. He tossed it on the table. It was a sash deep red, threaded with gold.
"Where?" "Pinned to my barn door,"
Don said.
"with a bone needle."
Thomas didn't flinch.
"Julian."
Isabel stood quietly in the corner, arms wrapped around herself.
"He never stopped watching,"
she whispered.
"He waited."
Thomas nodded.
"And now he wants us to know he's back."
Boone leaned forward, voice low.
"This isn't just him anymore. These are warnings, ritual, message."
Thomas rubbed a hand over his jaw.
"He's rebuilding."
Don stared at the sash.
"Or he never stopped."
That evening, Thomas walked Rosita home from the schoolhouse. She held his hand, humming a little tune from class, boots crunching softly in the snow. She seemed lighter lately, braver. Like the past few weeks had given her back something no one thought she'd ever recover. They reached the porch. She paused.
"What is it, Mija?"
She looked up at him, serious.
"I had a dream."
He crouched.
"Tell me." "It was dark,"
she whispered.
"But there were candles. A room full of them. And a voice said, 'She was never yours.'"
He cupped her face gently. Thomas's blood went cold.
"You're safe. I promise you that."
She nodded slowly, but her eyes said otherwise. Inside, Isabel had soup on the stove and the table set with care. Thomas sat beside Rosita and helped her with her homework. Simple things, letters, numbers, drawing shapes. But she was distracted. Her pencil shook. When she went to bed, Isabel lingered.
"She's sensing it,"
she said quietly. Thomas nodded.
"So am I."
"Isabel,
do we stay or do we run?"
He looked at her, then toward the window.
"I won't run again,"
he said.
"Neither will she."
The next day, a messenger arrived from the neighboring town of El Rito, panicked, half frozen, barely able to sit his horse. Boone brought him inside the jailhouse. Thomas, Don, and Isabel were already waiting. The man shivered beside the stove, sipping coffee.
"They came at night,"
he said.
"Didn't speak, just fire, smoke, took 3 children, left crosses burned into the schoolhouse floor."
Boone slammed his fist on the desk.
"Damn it."
Thomas leaned in.
"What did they look like?"
The man shook his head.
Hood's robes, but one of them limped.
Don stood suddenly, walked out the door without a word. Thomas followed him. Outside, snow fell again. He caught up with Don by the stables.
You okay?
Don stared into the trees.
He's not just calling the flock back,
Don said.
He's declaring war.
Thomas's voice was low.
Then we answer.
He said only one thing. That night, the town met again, this time in the schoolhouse, not the chapel. Boone laid out what they knew, a new group forming. Children taken. Old signs resurfacing. A man they thought was gone still alive, pulling strings from the dark. There was no panic, just silence. Until an old rancher stood. He had seen war, buried a son, lost cattle to raiders and crops to blight.
We don't bow to shadows.
One by one others stood too.
We fight. We defend our own. We make them regret coming back.
Boone looked at Tom's.
Then we prepare.
Don's plan was simple: use the old church on the ridge, burned years ago by lightning but still standing, roofless and solid as bone. It overlooked the town, visible from every trail, a perfect place for a final stand or a message. Tom's led the volunteers. They spent 2 days fortifying it, laying traps, reinforcing the doors, hiding rifles in the pews. Each night someone watched from the tree line. Each night Rosita dreamed of fire. On the third night Tom's tucked her in with an extra quilt and sat beside her bed.
Do you remember when we first met?
He asked. She nodded.
You found me in the snow.
He screamed.
You were stronger than the storm.
She reached out, placed her hand over his heart.
You're warmer now.
He swallowed thickly.
Get some sleep, mi amor,
he said.
Tomorrow might be loud.
She closed her eyes, and he sat there, guarding her dreams. Later that night, Isabel found him loading shells into his rifle on the porch.
You really believe he's coming back?
She asked. Thomas nodded.
Yes. And what if this isn't about Rosita anymore? It never was just about her, he said. It was always about belief, control. Scarface saw a world he wanted to shape. We said no.
She stepped closer, brushing his arm.
And if he doesn't come alone?
Thomas looked up at the stars, then at the dark line of trees beyond the snow-covered field.
He won't,
he said.
This ends where it started: fire, blood, and belief.
Isabel and Rosita were with Reyes, safe in the cellar under the clinic. The girl hadn't cried, not once. She just hugged Tom's hard that morning and said, snow fell slow and silent over the ridge. The old church stood like a skeleton in the white, roofless, battered by wind and time, yet still upright, still reaching toward heaven with arms of stone and ash. Candles flickered in the windows. Rifles lay ready in hidden places. Behind the altar Tom stood with Don and Boone. Watching the tree line through the gaps in the wall, the town was quiet below.
Be careful, Pap.
Don adjusted his coat and muttered. He still hadn't let go of those words.
They'll come just before dawn. That's how he works. Shadows and cold.
Boone cocked his rifle.
He thinks we're scared.
Thomas shook his head.
No, he thinks we've forgotten.
Julianed. The wind picked up. Then came the sound, footsteps in snow, soft but certain. Figures emerged from the trees, cloaked in black, faces hidden, torches raised. Julian walked in front. His limp was worse now, dragging one leg like a chained prisoner. But his posture remained proud, almost regal. A scar crossed one eye. The other burned with purpose. He carried no weapon. Only a book, bound in leather, marked with strange symbols, something that had belonged to Mother Elsie. Or maybe something older. He reached the church steps and stopped. Behind him 20 others formed a loose crescent. Men, women, boys barely old enough to shave, all silent, all waiting. Thomas stepped out first.
You rebuilt her. She never fell. She burned.
Thomas tilted his head.
So did you, and yet here we are.
Julian took a slow step forward.
You still don't understand. This world, your world, is too soft, too noisy, too weak to carry the truth. What truth is that? That pain cleanses. That suffering strips away the false.
Thomas let the silence stretch before answering.
I've seen what your truth does to children.
He glanced at Dawn. That took the smile off Julian's face.
You taught me better than this. You made me strong.
Dawn's voice was gravel.
I taught you how to survive. You twisted it into worship.
Julian turned back to Tom's.
Give me the girl, and this clean.
Thomas stepped down one stair.
She's not yours. She never was yours either. I don't care.
The two men stared at each other, the gap between them as deep as a canyon and as thin as breath. Then Julian raised the book, and chaos began. The cult surged forward, weapons drawn. Gunfire cracked from inside the church. Flames erupted from a thrown torch, caught the old pews instantly. Screamed smoke. The air filled with fury. Thomas fired, dropped one attacker. Don swung his rifle like a club at another. Boone took a shot to the shoulder and kept fighting. Blood hit the snow in black streaks. The cult was stronger than expected, frenzied, desperate. But Santa Rosa was ready. Men and women who had once shied from confrontation now fought with quiet resolve. They didn't panic, they didn't break. Thomas moved through the fire like it meant nothing. He followed the trail Julian left, half-burned cloth, blood drops, footprints in the ash. He found him at the altar, alone again, holding the book like a weapon.
You won't shoot me,
Julian said.
Why not? Because deep down, you know I'm right. The world is broken. You're just afraid to admit it.
Thomas stared at him, eyes tired, voice low.
No, I just don't think broken people need more fire. I think they need a place to rest.
Julian's hands shook. He opened the book. A single shot rang out. The book fell from his hands. So did he. Thomas stood there, smoke curling from the barrel of his rifle. He didn't move for a long time. The fire died by sunrise. Snow began falling again, soft, erasing the blood, the prints, the signs that anything terrible had ever happened there. Boone sat with his back to a wall, arm in a sling, sipping coffee laced with whiskey. Don sat beside him, holding a bloodied cloth to his ribs.
Think it's over?
Boone asked. Don looked at the sunrise.
This part is.
Down below, townsfolk pulled bodies from the snow, wrapped them in blankets, buried them under stone. No songs, just silence. Tom stood at the edge of town, watching the wind carry smoke east. Rosita ran toward him, Isabel right behind. He knelt, caught her in his arms. She hugged him hard.
You came back,
she said.
I always will.
Isabel brushed snow from his shoulder, then leaned into him. Her warmth said everything words couldn't. That spring, the town rebuilt the chapel, not for sermons, but for safety, for memory, and when children passed through it, they didn't whisper about ghosts anymore. They spoke of courage, of people who chose light even when the darkness came knocking. Thomas never left again. He helped teach in the schoolhouse. He rode patrol when Boone needed extra eyes. He built a fence around the edge of town, not to keep things out, but to remind them what they stood for. Rosita grew. And one day, many years later, when she was older than the age she'd been stolen, she stood in that same chapel and told a room full of people, I was taken once, but I was not lost. I was not broken. I was returned. Because some stories don't end in fire, they end in warmth, in hands held, in names remembered, in choosing every single day to walk toward the light. She was never yours. She was always ours.